Welcome to part 3 of the Supporting English Language Learners module in SUU's Global Engagement Academy. This video focuses on providing opportunities for reading and listening. So in the previous video, we talked about how you can highlight the language of your field and explicitly help students understand how academic English is used in your particular field and how that can differ from the use of English generally. In this video, we want to focus on opportunities that you can provide students to read and listen to the kinds of language that are used in your field. So our goals here is to talk about input and talk about why it's important to provide students with opportunities to read and listen. Then we'll talk about some tools that can help students to decode and understand text. And then we'll talk about some strategies that you can incorporate into your course that will help students understand more effective listening and reading strategies for the kinds of texts that they'll encounter in your field. Let's talk about a couple keywords. So the word input, when we talk about input in terms of language, we're specifically talking about reading and listening. Sometimes this is called receptive language, but it's really is a very active activity. We work hard when we're doing reading and listening, especially when we're dealing with challenging language or challenging content. Another way to think of input as decoding language. So the language is already in a code. We have to use our knowledge of how that language works to get the meaning from the language. So decoding skills or input. And then text, we'll use text in a more general sense, not just to mean something that's written, but also we can talk about an oral text. A spoken text. That listening can also refer to listening to a text. Now, let's talk about the importance of meaning-focused input. We want to give students opportunities to read and listen. They need it. They need this practice. It's helpful and useful for them. So if you have international students in your class, it's not a good idea to eliminate reading and listening from the course or for really any of your students. But what we do need to do is provide adequate support so that they can do the kinds of reading and listening that people need to do in your field. This is related to a concept in the linguistics field called comprehensible input. And really this theory is that text needs to be at a certain level. A learner needs to have enough language to understand that text in order to really understand the content or the meaning of the text. And so this question comes up is how many words must a reader already know from a text, and again, a written text or an oral text, in order to understand the text and gain from its meaning? Because ultimately that's your goal, right? You're not a language instructor, you're a content area instructor. You're only using language to convey the meaning that you want your learners to understand. And really what studies have shown is that for an informational text, like a textbook or an article that you assign your students to read, they need to know 95% of the words in that text in order to have at least a 70% comprehension of the meaning of the text. This number even increases for recreational reading. If we just want to read for fun, we need to know 98% of the words in that text in order to feel like we can actually understand what's happening. So this means that really students need to know a lot of words in order to understand the text in our field. Now, thankfully, a lot of the words that they're going to encounter and the most frequent words that they're going to encounter are the high frequency words in English, those first 2,000 words in English. And most learners are going to know that, but it's really sort of that last 18 or 15% of words that might be highly academic and might be field specific. And if students don't already know those words and have some familiarity with them, they're not going to understand the text that you're asking them to read. So let's talk about some strategies that you could use. Well, one of them is you could pre-teach vocabulary. If you know students are going to be reading a chapter, or you know you want them to watch a recorded lecture or presentation, or even just before they come to your class, you could give them a heads up and say, here's some important words that you're going to need in order to understand. And you need to research and understand these words before you come to class or before you start the reading. Many first-year textbooks actually have gotten much better at this, and they'll have sort of a glossary at the beginning of a chapter and say, these are some important words for the chapter, and then throughout the chapter, they may highlight them. You can do this yourself. If you're working with a text and it doesn't already have vocabulary highlighted and defined for your students. There are tools you can use to put your text through a vocabulary analyzer, and it will tell you which words are less common, which words are very field specific. And then you can find out which words are very common and important to the meaning of your text, and you could just highlight those for your students, whether it's on Canvas or at the beginning of a lecture, and just say, here are some words that are crucial to understanding this week's texts. And then those students will be better prepared before they start reading to text to know what those words are. If you want to know more about how to do this, please contact me and the American Language and Culture Center, and we can do a one-on-one session where we meet with you, show you the website. It's not especially user-friendly, but once you have someone guide you through it, it's very quick and fast for you to be able to get that analysis for any textbook chapter that you're dealing with. Another way you can help students is show them and highlight contextual clues in a text. So one of them is using we think of it as multimodal, right? Using images, videos, providing background information that will help students understand the meaning of the text. Offering repetition or remixing. If you've got a textbook chapter, is there a YouTube video or some other lecture video on the same topic that they could read? Or maybe a second article that you have, or an open educational resource textbook that maybe isn't your preferred source, but it covers a similar topic that could be an alternate option for students if they're struggling with one particular text, that they could have another option to still get that input and understand the concepts that you're trying to teach them. You could highlight discourse markers. So a discourse marker is a key word or phrase that helps us understand how ideas in a text are connected. So these might be words that transition between maybe a process, first, second, then, later on. These might be words that help show whether ideas are in agreement with each other or whether they're in opposition to one another. And good readers who read a lot are already picking up on these words. But we have some students, whether they're international or domestic, who just aren't very good at picking up on these words naturally. But if you can highlight them in a text, or when you're giving a lecture, highlight some of your discourse markers. Okay, now on the other hand, and you remind them, okay, this is in contrast to this theory that I just talked about. That can help students become more aware and recognize the value of identifying those discourse markers to understand how a text creates larger meaning. You can also demonstrate your reading practices. A lot of students don't know how to read a textbook, or they don't know how to read a research article, or whatever kind of text you use in your field. If you can take 10 minutes in one of your class sessions with a real reading that you're asking them to read and show them how you read through it. When I read research articles in the applied linguistics field, I show my students how to do that. I show them that we read a title and an abstract, and then we often skip most of the introduction, at least during a first read. We might read the research questions, we might skip the methods section, possibly we'll look at the results, but we might just go all the way to conclusion and find the results. And then if I have time, I'll go back and read. So many students are used to reading narrative text where they start at the beginning and they go to the end. But lots of academic readers and academic text should not be approached that way. So identify how text should be read in your field, and then model that process to your students so that they're better prepared to understand how you are expecting them to engage with those texts. Same thing with our listening processes. You could model some listening processes. If there's a video you want them to watch, or even a lecture that you're giving, if you tell students, here's how I recommend you organize your notes as you listen to this. And maybe it's, it's a T-chart where you are comparing two things, or maybe you're trying to give them a historical perspective. And so they need to list things chronologically, and they might highlight some dates. However you want them to get better at listening and note-taking, it may be helpful to model that process for them. Or after a lecture, you tell them, hey, here's the outline that I used to prepare this lecture. And that can help them sort of make those connections between how they're taking notes and how maybe you recommend they take notes. And that can help them adjust their strategies to focus on the right kinds of information. So I hope that this video has helped you see that absolutely, reading and listening are important. We want students to practice these skills. We don't want you to diminish your ability to encourage students to develop these skills in your field. What we do hope is that you'll be inspired to find some simple strategies that you can incorporate into your course so that listening and reading for your students is more manageable and more successful. If you have any questions about any of these strategies, or you want to share strategies with us that we can share with other instructors, please reach out and contact the American Language and Culture Center.